scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the window and everything seemed normal. But something felt different today. As Peppa climbed down from her bed, she noticed that George's eyes were open, but he wasn't moving. He was staring straight ahead with a blank expression, completely motionless. When she called his name, he didn't respond. His eyes seemed darker than usual, almost black. Peppa ran downstairs to find Mummy and Daddy Pig, but the house felt strangely quiet. In the kitchen, she found them sitting at the table, completely still. Mummy Pig's coffee cup was halfway to her lips, frozen in time. Daddy Pig's newspaper was held up in front of his face, but his hands weren't moving. Their eyes had the same dark, empty look as George's. Confused and frightened, Peppa tried shaking them, but they remained like statues. She ran outside, hoping to find help, but the entire neighborhood was the same. Mrs. Rabbit was standing in her garden, watering can in hand, but no water was flowing. The flowers around her had turned gray and wilted. Even the birds in the sky had stopped mid-flight. Peppa realized she was the only one who could still move in this frozen world. The silence was deafening. No wind, no sounds, just her own breathing and footsteps echoing in the empty streets. She tried calling out, but her voice seemed to disappear into the void. As she walked through the town, Peppa noticed that shadows were moving independently of their owners. The shadow of a tree would sway, while the tree itself remained perfectly still. Her own shadow seemed to lag behind her movements, as if it was reluctant to follow. The playground where she loved to play was filled with children, but they were all motionless statues. Susie Sheep was on the swing, suspended in midair. Pedro Pony was climbing the slide, never moving up or down. Their faces all wore the same blank expression, and their eyes had turned that same disturbing black color. Peppa tried to leave the town, but every road led her back to the same places. The world had become a loop, trapping her in this nightmare of stillness. The sky began to darken, but the sun remained in the same position, creating an unnatural twilight. As night fell, strange whispers began to fill the air. They seemed to come from the frozen people around her, though their mouths never moved. The whispers spoke her name over and over, growing louder and more insistent. They were calling her to join them, to stop moving, to become part of their eternal stillness. Peppa ran back home, but even her own house felt foreign now. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She could hear the whispers following her, getting closer and closer, promising her peace if she would just stop running. In her bedroom, Peppa found George exactly as she had left him, staring with those black, empty eyes. But now he was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin. He spoke for the first time that day, his voice hollow and echoing. He told her that stillness was perfection. Peppa felt her own movements becoming slower and heavier. Her legs felt like they were made of stone. The whispers were now a roar in her ears, and she could feel the darkness creeping into her own eyes. She looked in the mirror and saw that her reflection was already frozen. As the last of her strength faded away, Peppa realized that she was becoming part of the stillness too. The world was quiet now, peaceful. Her eyes turned black, her smile became fixed, and she joined the eternal silence.
The lost episode of Peppa Pig that never aired. Peppa Pig, the puppet friend. It started with a simple puppet. Daddy Pig found it in a box in the attic, old, handmade, with floppy arms and faded fabric. He thought George would like it and placed it on his bed. "What color is it?" Peppa asked. "It used to be red, I think," said Daddy Pig. "Now, just grey." The next day, George stopped playing with his dinosaur. He spent all his time with the puppet, talking to it, whispering, laughing. "What's its name?" Peppa asked. "She doesn't say it," George replied. "She's just a friend." "Do you make her talk?" "No," George smiled. "She answers." Peppa thought it was just a game, but that night she woke up to a sound. "George?" He was giggling softly. "Who's there?" There was an answer. Not George's voice, not a child's, a deep, hoarse adult voice. "I am a friend." Peppa froze. She couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. George was lying with his back to her. The puppet sat as usual on his bed, but its eyes were slightly open, even though they had been painted on before. In the morning, Peppa said nothing. She just hid the puppet in the closet, but an hour later, it was back on George's bed, sitting in the same position. Only now, its neck looked longer, and it had a smile. "She said you're angry," George said, "that you don't want me to play with her. She knows who you are and who you were." "What?" "She saw. Before." That evening, Daddy Pig threw the puppet away, took it out to the bin. That night, there was a scraping noise outside the door, like something dragging its limbs across the floor. Then, silence. In the morning, the puppet was sitting on the windowsill, wet. The fabric was stained, like with dirt or something worse. On the wall of the children's room, someone had drawn in charcoal. "You shouldn't have touched her." That night, Peppa stayed awake, watching. The puppet lay on the floor, still, until George giggled again. Then it lifted slightly. Its head jerked up, and it said, "I've always been with him." Peppa screamed. Daddy Pig ran into the room. The puppet lay still. But it had something new, a string, running from its back up to the ceiling, even though no one in the house had ever hung it.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never aired, The Mirror Game. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when Peppa and George discovered an old mirror in Grandpa Pig's attic. The mirror was ornate, with a heavy golden frame that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "Look, George, we can play the mirror game," Peppa exclaimed, standing in front of the glass. "You copy everything I do." At first, it was fun. Peppa would wave, and George would wave back. She would jump, and he would jump too. But then Peppa noticed something strange in the reflection. Her mirror image was moving just a fraction of a second too late. "George, look at this," she whispered, raising her hand slowly. In the mirror, her reflection hesitated before copying the movement. George giggled, thinking it was part of the game, but when he looked at his own reflection, his smile faded. His mirror self was smiling wider than he was, showing teeth that seemed too sharp. "Peppa," George whispered, but when he looked at his sister, she was staring intently at the mirror, her eyes glazed over. In the reflection, Peppa saw herself in the same attic, but everything was slightly wrong. The boxes were in different places, the light was dimmer, and there was someone else there, another Peppa, watching from the shadows. "Who are you?" the real Peppa asked her reflection. "The mirror." Peppa tilted her head and smiled. "I'm you, but better. I don't have to listen to Mummy and Daddy. I can do whatever I want." George tugged at Peppa's dress, but she didn't respond. She was completely absorbed by the conversation with her reflection. "Would you like to switch places?" the mirror Peppa asked. "You could stay here where it's quiet, and I could go live your life." The real Peppa found herself nodding. The mirror world looked so peaceful, so perfect. No rules, no bedtime, no vegetables to eat. "Just touch the glass," the mirror Peppa instructed. As Peppa reached toward the mirror, George saw something terrifying. In the reflection, there were dozens of other children behind the mirror Peppa, all the children who had made the same choice. They stood motionless, their eyes empty, trapped forever in the glass world. "Peppa, no!" George shouted, grabbing her hand just as her fingers touched the cold surface. The mirror rippled like water. For a moment, Peppa felt herself being pulled forward, but George's grip held her back. The mirror Peppa's face twisted with anger. "You can't stop this forever," the reflection hissed. "I'll be waiting. Every mirror, every reflection, every piece of glass. I'll be there waiting for my chance." The children ran from the attic, but as they passed every mirror in Grandpa Pig's house, they saw her, the other Peppa, following them, watching them, waiting. Even now, when Peppa brushes her teeth or George washes his hands, they see her in the bathroom mirror. She waves at them, smiles at them, and whispers promises of a world where they could be free. But they never touch the glass again, because they know that some games are too dangerous to play, and some reflections show more than just what's real.
A lost Peppa Pig episode that never aired on TV. Night fell upon Peppa Pig's house. The room was silent, disturbed only by the faint creaking of old floorboards. Peppa, lying on the top bunk, couldn't sleep. She heard the steady breathing of George, sleeping below. Suddenly, from under the bottom bunk, a quiet, barely discernible sound, like a whisper, reached her ears. It was so faint that Peppa initially thought she had imagined it. But the whisper repeated, a little louder this time, and now it seemed insistent, as if someone was trying to get her attention. Peppa cautiously leaned over the edge of her bunk, trying to make out anything in the darkness. Nothing was visible, but the whisper continued, and now it seemed very close, as if someone was breathing right into her ear. Peppa felt goosebumps prickle her skin. She slowly slid off the bed and onto the floor. The whisper was coming from under George's bed. She cautiously peered underneath. Nothing was visible in the darkness, but the whisper intensified, and now it was accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping, as if someone was gently scratching wood. Peppa reached out to feel for the source of the sound, and her fingers brushed against something soft and cold. It was a small rag doll that George always kept with him. The doll was lying face down, and Peppa carefully turned it over. The doll's eyes were empty buttons, but now they glowed with a dull, greenish light. From its mouth, which was just a drawn line, came the same whisper. The doll began to move slowly in Peppa's hands, its small arms and legs twitching as if it was trying to break free. The whisper grew louder, turning into a chorus of children's voices repeating the same word. Play, play. Peppa tried to throw the doll away, but her hands seemed glued to it. The doll pressed against her, its cold body penetrating through her clothes, freezing Peppa from within. The voices grew louder, filling the room, penetrating every cell of her body. Peppa felt her consciousness begin to blur and reality distort. She saw shadows on the walls begin to dance, taking on bizarre forms, and the furniture in the room seemed to come alive. The last thing Peppa saw were the doll's glowing green eyes, staring at her with inexpressible longing, and her own reflection in them, distorted by terror. Then, darkness consumed her. In the morning, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig entered the room. The beds were empty. Only the old rag doll lay on the floor, from which a quiet, barely discernible whisper and tapping could be heard. And sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, if you pass by this house, you might hear that sound coming from the room and see two dull green dots glowing in the darkness, as if someone is still waiting to play. The visitor from the wall. When it was raining outside, Peppa and George were playing in their room. Everything was as usual, blocks, toys, laughter. But then Peppa noticed something strange. A crack in the wall right next to her bed seemed bigger than before, and inside it, there was something that looked like a face. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Maybe it was just a drop of water running down the wall. But when she looked again, eyes, narrow, dark, motionless, and a mouth stretched into a long, thin smile. Peppa blinked, and the face was gone. She didn't say anything to George. She just turned away and went to sleep, telling herself it was only her imagination. But the next night, she saw it again. The face was closer, and now it moved. Not quickly, no, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if it was sliding beneath the layers of wallpaper. It was like watching a fish beneath the ice. Its eyes moved. They were watching Peppa. Peppa told Mummy Pig, but she only said that maybe the wall was a bit damp. Daddy Pig promised to patch the crack. But when he entered the room with his tools that evening, there was no crack. On the third night, Peppa woke up to a rustling sound. George was asleep, covered completely with his blanket. Peppa slowly turned toward the wall. Now the face was very close. It filled the whole crack. And then it came out. First came a hand, grey, thin, with long fingers like it was made of paper. Then the second hand. It was pulling itself out, blending with the color of the wallpaper. Its body was flat, as if it had always been part of the wall. It made no sound, only movement, slowly, smiling. Peppa couldn't scream. She was frozen, watching as the thing emerged. It had no legs. Its lower body just faded into the air. It slid across the floor, leaving a wet grey trail behind. It approached George's bed and stopped. A few long seconds, and then it disappeared. When the parents came in the morning, Peppa was sitting on her bed staring at the wall. George was asleep, but he never woke up again. The doctors couldn't explain it. They said his heart just stopped. Since then, Peppa no longer sleeps in that room. The wall was painted over, new wallpaper was put up. But sometimes, if you look closely at the pattern, you can see it shifting, as if something is moving underneath, and if you stare long enough, it smiles again. Peppa Pig. The school that isn't there. It all started on a Monday. Madame Gazelle told the class that today's lessons would be held in the old building, a place where children used to study long ago. "It's just nearby," she said. "A short walk, for a change of scenery." Peppa was surprised. No one had ever mentioned another school, not teachers, not even her parents. The children walked along a narrow path outside the town. The wind grew stronger. The sun hid behind clouds. Soon, a building appeared, grey, cracked, with tall, narrow windows. It was unnaturally quiet. "Is it on the map?" asked Pedro. Madame Gazelle smiled but didn't answer. Inside it was dim. The walls were stained. The doors creaked. They were led to a classroom at the end of the hall. Desks were crooked. Chairs didn't match. On the board, faint scratches remained, as if someone had written with a nail. "We're only here for one day," said Madame Gazelle. "Start drawing." But Peppa couldn't focus. The classroom window faced an empty field. But each time she looked away and back again, it felt like someone was standing behind the glass. Footsteps echoed in the hall, though no one had left. Sometimes there was a soft creaking sound, and then whispers, very close to the floor. During break, the children walked to the stairs. "Let's go up," Zoe suggested. Madame Gazelle appeared suddenly. "You mustn't go upstairs." Her voice sounded strange, muffled, as if coming from far away. The day crawled by slowly. The hallway clock didn't tick. Pedro said the mirrors in the bathroom were all covered with paper. Rebecca noticed Madame Gazelle's coat had buttons sewn on the wrong side. When it was finally time to leave, the children were relieved. But it was already getting dark outside, though it should have been early afternoon. Madame Gazelle told them to walk in a line. Peppa lingered, looking back. Figures stood in the windows, still, shadowy. They didn't move, but they were watching. That evening, Peppa opened a map on her tablet. The school they visited wasn't there. She showed Daddy Pig. "We were here today," she said, "but there's nothing on the map." Daddy Pig looked closely. "There hasn't been anything here for years, Peppa. I've walked by that spot hundreds of times, just a field." "But we were inside," Peppa insisted. Daddy shrugged. "Maybe it was a temporary structure, something old, but it shouldn't be there." That night, Peppa couldn't sleep. Before bed, she opened her backpack. At the bottom lay a scrap of paper, dusty, crumpled. On it, a message scratched in black charcoal. "We are still here,